I'm glad to see so many familiar faces in this assemblage. I'm delighted that you all managed to come tonight. The book you've just heard about has a 20-year history, and to the extent that I had anything to do with it, it is the product of two fortuitous, and some might say serendipitous, encounters I had along the way. But as a prelude to the first encounter, I must tell you that for almost 50 years, from 1943 to 1991, I was absolutely ignorant of the Marcel Network. All that I knew is what I was told by a lady who met me and my brother by prearrangement on a street of Nice one day in mid-September 1943, shortly after the occupation of the city by German forces. She presented herself as Mademoiselle Sylvie. I was then 10 years old and my brother was 5. In parentheses, just a few background details to put things in a context. We had been separated at that particular point from our parents fully a year before. Their fate we did not know of until many years later. The family had been arrested, as Andrew told you a bit earlier, on the way to Switzerland at a small town of Annemasse on the frontier by French police, and sent to a large detention camp by the name of Rivesaltes in southwest France. We children were soon released from it, but our parents stayed on, and not long after that were taken through Drancy near Paris on to Auschwitz, where they died. We, at this point, were taken in by a cousin of my mother who lived in Nice, a French citizen, and spent 9 months with her until this, I should say, was early 1943. And by September 1943, as you've heard already, Germans took over from the Italian occupation forces. And very soon thereafter, the cousin we were staying with went into town to do some shopping, accompanied by a French Christian friend, and was promptly arrested in a street roundup and disappeared without trace, never to be heard from again. The French friend who accompanied her quickly came back to the house where we were staying to alert us, my friend, my brother and myself, and at that particular point we were left alone in the world. Luckily, a neighbor, friendly neighbor, took us in and kept us there for 3 days. And then on the 3rd day, told us that we would go on a walk casually and we would encounter a woman who would take over from that point and lead us to a safe place. The lady we encountered, by the name of Mademoiselle Sylvie, took us in hand and within a matter of 2 hours deposited us in Cannes, only about 20 kilometers away from Nice, at a children's home by the name of Le Rayon de Soleil, which translates into the ray of sunshine, which it turned out to live up to fully. Mademoiselle Sylvie had introduced herself as being from the Diocese of Nice, a member of the bishop's staff. And that is all that we knew about her. I strongly I accepted and held on to the notion that for some 50 years that indeed she was a Catholic lady, probably a social worker associated with the diocese, and that she had received instruction from higher up in the diocese to take us to Cannes. For all of these years, we felt beholden to the Diocese of Nice for the good fortune that we found ourselves in. In Cannes, we were to stay all together at this home for children for 3 years. The first of which, under wartime conditions, Cannes was liberated on the 24th of August, 1944. And we stayed on for nearly 2 years after that, partly hoping still that our parents might have survived. And incidentally, for those who might be puzzled that as late as 46, one was still hoping. Some 6,000 or so survivors from Auschwitz were taken by the Soviets to Moscow and other points east for rehabilitation and what have you, which was perfectly fine in intent, except that the Soviets refused to reveal to international agencies, the Red Cross and others, the names of the people they held. And so for many of us, as late as, I think, May of 1946, there was hope that our parents and other relatives might be among those held in Russia. It wasn't until that time, namely mid-1946, that all hope disappeared. And we also were waiting to rejoin family in the United States on my mother's side that had offered to take us in, and had to wait for legislation in Congress to change to enable orphans, war orphans, to be brought in under separate quota, and there was a long delay in this coming about. And it is in September 1946 that we finally made it here. I should add that the 3 years we spent in the children's home were paradoxically wonderful years. It was a home run on a private home, I should add, not assistance publique, if that conjures up ideas in some of you as to what homes in France, children's homes in France, were in that era. It was a home run on very progressive ideas. There were a wonderful couple, young, by the name of Alban and Germaine Faure, and their names appear, by the way, on the big panel in the Holocaust Museum here in Washington as the Righteous, which they became in 1985, early in the effort by the Israeli government to recognize non-Jews who, at great risk to themselves, had come and helped Jews to hide and survive. The family were to become and to remain for the rest of their lives our family in France. Now, fast forward to 1991, 48 years later, and the first of the two fateful encounters that I had and that are in the background of this book. I'm now a reasonable facsimile of a native-bred American. I'm visiting an aunt in Israel and decide to go to Jerusalem for one purpose, to take a picture of a tree planted in the garden of the Yad Vashem. The Yad Vashem, incidentally, for those who are not familiar with it, is the great memorial built in Israel to the deported and the dead, and similar in many respects to the Holocaust Museum here in Washington, with the added function of recognizing worldwide non-Jews who came to the aid of Jews and distinguished themselves by the risks that they took doing so. And the practice has been from the outset to plant a tree within the confines of the grounds of the Yad Vashem in memory of these distinguished people. And I was in Israel visiting an aunt and decided to go to Jerusalem to the Yad Vashem to take a picture of the tree planted in honor of the founder and directors of the home there. My brother and I spent paradoxically, three very happy years. At the Yad Vashem, I meet Lucien Lazare, a French-Israeli historian in charge of the selection process of the righteous in France. I tell him my Catholic rescue story with Mademoiselle Sylvie. He, with a broad smile on his face, proceeds to reveal to me that George, my brother, and I were in fact the children of the Marcel Network, and that my Catholic rescue story with Mademoiselle Sylvie was in fact none other than with Dr. Odette Rosenstock, the co-founder of the Marcel Network, with her clandestine alias or nom de guerre. He then proceeded to reveal to me the history that, in fact, we totally ignored about ourselves. And needless to say, I was absolutely stunned by that information. Then Lucien Lazare, sitting across his desk, scribbled something on a piece of paper and passed it to me and said, "This is a telephone number in Paris. When you're next there, give him a call." Well, I would be in Paris 2 weeks later. I did call, and an elderly voice answered, and I barely had time to identify myself that he answered, "Yes, I know you. You had a brother. We placed both of you in Cannes 48 years after the event." We met a couple of days later at a well-known French cafe in Paris. It was a deeply moving and joyful occasion for the three of us. It is difficult to characterize an event such as this, but safe to say, it launched us on a warm friendship that lasted through the last decade of their lives in the 90s. In the 90s, I had opportunity of passing through Paris quite frequently on the way to Africa or from Africa. And that gave me the opportunity of calling them each time and invariably being invited to come and see them for lunch or for dinner at what was surprisingly, a very small apartment in a rather modest part of town. At that time, I suspect I was one of only 4 children, so-called children, of the 527 who had maintained or renewed contact with them. And most probably, I was more insistently curious about the life they had led than the others, my peers. As curious indeed as the Abadis were about my own life and that of my brother during that same half-century span. I had particular reason to want to see them again and again. Ever since the war, as Fred Coleman has already stated, the Abadis had refused persistently to meet with historians and journalists and anyone else who wished to speak with them about the war. All of their many friends in the world of the theater, where Moussa Abadi had become quite prominent as a theater critic, and others from other walks of life, were totally ignorant of what the Abadis had done during the war. Lucien Lazare himself, author of a noted book about Jewish civil resistance in the war, during the war, and non-military civil resistance, had tried for years, a book published incidentally in 1988, had tried for years while he was doing research to contact the Abadis and had, without exception, been denied access to them. So he was reduced for the book that came out in '88 in French and in 1996 in English, published by Columbia University Press as Rescue as Resistance, the title. He was reduced to write 2 rather lean paragraphs in a large book about the Marcel Network that hardly did justice to the nature of the exploit. But for me, the Abadis opened up fully and without hesitation, because I suppose it took me as one of their own. And over the first 2 or 3 visits, shared with me the details of what they had accomplished during the war. Immediately, something that struck me as a truly extraordinary achievement conducted by 2 extraordinary individuals. I was struck immediately by the importance of the story and became convinced that the Abadis had an obligation to history to tell it. And given their age, I became fearful that they might disappear too soon and take the story with them. So early on, knowing that both of them were writers, and Moussa was already a published writer, I began to urge them to write their own story. A long monograph at least, but preferably a book. And got absolutely nowhere with them. I came to badger them. They took it as good-natured harassment, but gave me no greater success. However, in 1994, there was a first break in that silence. The Abadis accorded a good interview to the editor of a new publication then published by an association of French hidden children. But to me and to the larger diffusion and retention of the story and all of its details, they continued to resist. So meantime, I getting nowhere with them and feeling that a more detailed, complete and detailed account was necessary, I began as a last desperate move to lay ground for a different approach, to get the Abadis to sit for an open-ended oral history recorded interview. The Fortunoff Archive of Holocaust Testimonies, based at Yale University, which I happen to know well, agreed to sponsor the product. Finally, in 1995, the Abadis relented and accepted to respond to questions put to them by French historian Annette Viviorca. The tape, 7 hours in length, has been on deposit at Yale and accessible to researchers internationally. Over the 10 years that followed, from 95 to about 96, a few specialists, researchers, consulted the tape, but it had not yet yielded anything of the consequence that I was hoping for. A number of works had appeared in the meantime, but all of limited or specialized scope, as well as a French public TV documentary film. So fast forward again to the summer of 2006, the second fateful encounter. In Paris that year with my wife, Anne-Marie, who's somewhere here in the audience, London friends of ours invited us to meet close friends from Paris of theirs for dinner at a restaurant. The friends were Fred and Nadine Coleman. Fred turned out to be not only a fellow American, but a fellow Princetonian. We had followed the same program of studies at the Woodrow Wilson School. SFS people here will know what that establishment is all about. And we had an early brush with journalism. Fred as a stringer correspondent at Princeton for the New York Times, and I as a stringer correspondent for the Time Life Fortune organization when I was studying at Oxford. He blossomed as a journalist, a professional journalist, and I turned to other things. But in Paris, then and there, we had the makings for instant kinship. A few months later, my wife and I were in Paris again, and the four of us met. And Fred got me to speak of my own early checkered past. The Colemans arranged to see the French TV documentary that had been made some years earlier. And on our return home in Washington, there was an email from them saying how much they had been moved by it and asking me a whole long pile of questions, which I answered, and finished with the line, not aiming at Fred in particular, "It is a long story awaiting someone to write it." Very soon thereafter, Fred took the fish hook and replied he might be interested, but first he wanted to assure himself that the material was available. The archives, survivors who knew the Abadis personally, others, and especially a number of children who had been saved by them. But within a matter of a couple of months, he sent me another email saying he had satisfied himself and he would do it. Delighted, I pledged to him my fullest support and cooperation, which indeed is what he also received from the many other live people whose memories he would get to probe. and also from the two principals, Moussa and Odette, sadly no longer alive, but whose 7 hours of taped interviews contributed precious testimony in their own voice. And so, with duly modest pride and much delight that his volume has come out and is now to be read, brilliantly produced, I commend the book to all of you. But a last word. If a book can be said to have godparents, it is this one. And I want to recognize here, especially from London, Mike and Cecile Gordon, who unwittingly got us to meet Fred and Nadine Coleman, and with the consequences that you're now familiar with. So wherever they are, thank you. And one last word, and I think, I'm not sure whether she's here, but there happens to be one other Marcel Network child, so-called child, who lives in the Washington area. I think she's there at the far distance. Françoise Brem, whom I got to meet 20 years ago when I first became aware of the Marcel Network, and who has become a friend, and who also figures in the book as one of the children interviewed by Fred. Yeah. Françoise is not altogether mobile these days, and I don't know what is happening. I'm half blinded by the lights, so I don't know what's happening. In any event, this is my part of my modest contribution to this event, but one that I thought might be of interest since the product that you're now being told about is the outcome of chance and persistence over a 20-year period. Thank you.